last time we left you was sort of the situation that Kakaako was going to have to turn into something for people to make money off of it, specifically the Ward family, the Ward Foundation, I think it was called by then. General Growth Properties had taken over the area. This was all largely in retail, but there was a limit to the amount of retail, especially since GGP also owned Ala Moana Center. The last thing they wanted to do was build more shopping area out at Ward and actually then predate on their own profits they were making off of Ala Moana. And so the idea comes of putting in high rises comes up again, as I mentioned last time. The problem you've got with all that is very simply the fact that you just don't physically have the space to put more buildings in, because you can put the buildings in, but you can't fit the cars. And because we're an entirely urbanized, automobile driven society, even more so in some ways in the mainland when you consider the number of cars on a very small island, basically that was impossible. And so this is sort of what this image we see here is what they wanted, but they couldn't figure out how to get it. And so what they did is they went back to the drawing board. What they decided to do was basically change the rules. And they predicated this upon a bunch of things, but the most basic one is very pragmatic level, simply cost. They could not afford to expand the road net to the extent needed to basically make it accessible from the freeways to a massive increase in, basically quadrupling 5 times the population smacked in a small area here. And so what they did is they came up with an interesting argument, because it makes sense from an environmental standpoint. By the 1990s, this was becoming a huge issue in the mainland, with the whole issue of environmental responsibility and the realization that while high rises might not be attractive, they in many ways were more environmentally responsible than a subdivision. And so General Growth Properties jumps on all this, comes up with this absolutely fascinating plan that they present to the state HCDA, the same folks that taxpayers' expense had condemned and taken over this property. And basically tell them, well, what we want to do is we want to put up high rises. We don't want to increase car traffic. And so the way that we're going to do that is, because car traffic's already incredibly onerous down here. You have to remember pre-COVID, before the buildings were going down in here between Ala Moana Center and the retail down here, as Christmas time, Thanksgiving would approach, Ward Avenue, all these streets would basically just be in gridlock. And so they said, we've got to avoid that. And we don't want to spend the money on the roads. We can't expand the roads that much anyways. There'd be too many people dispossessed. So what we're going to do is we're going to make people not use their cars. Now, this had been an ongoing attempt since the 1970s. When the bus system became popular, the original push was you were going to cut down the number of automobiles on the road. Ride sharing was heavily promoted in the 80s and 90s. It was a total failure here. And so what happened is, where all these different attempts have been made, rail being the most recent, to get people out of cars. And this is not just here. This is also in the mainland. Various types of rail transit systems had been proposed and actually put in place. BART, for example, in the Bay Area. I can't remember the name of the system in Portland. So all these light rail and other types of bus systems basically did work. What they did is those people who were poor enough they probably couldn't have a car would use them. But the people with cars would just use them, sort of like let them eat cake type thing. And what GGP decided is they're going to flip this whole thing on its head. They pointed out that educating people and convincing people to not use cars doesn't work. It's always not in my backyard. In other words, let my neighbors not use their car, but I need my car. And we see this here at Chaminade campus, and also even more so at UH, is that students are on one hand very environmentally responsible. On the other hand, they've almost all got wheels. And they're very big on the fact that other people should use their cars less, but they need their car. And then they're not, it's not to pick on students. It is the way it is, especially here on Oahu. And yet the reality is, of course, that you don't really need a car to get around most of urban Honolulu. But you need it socially. You need it for a whole mess of experiential, very American culture reasons, of which the actual functionality of the automobile is pretty limited. You remember our whole discussion way back in the suburbs, with the idea that you actually decrease house space to increase car storage space. So Americans have become incredibly dysfunctional about cars, and cars are just an incredible nightmare environmentally in a whole mess of ways. And so what GGP decided is, well, the only way you're going to get people to stop using cars is not by educating them, because they won't be educated. What you're going to do is when you put in these high rises, you're not going to give them parking spaces. So their proposal for Kakaako was very simple. You put in these high rises. This is the most recent plan. We'll get back. We'll see this again later. But what you do is you provide almost no parking. What they proposed to HCCD is unlike other areas of Honolulu or other urban centers in the US. You limit these units to one parking stall per unit. So that now it cuts down the amount of parking in terms of the structures, which makes it cheaper, ironically, to put the building up, which is convenient. Because you're now limiting the number of cars. You're not really massively increasing, despite the fact you've got all these high rises. You're not hugely increasing the actual number of cars that are available, are going to be on the street at any one time, because you now allow no on-street parking. You only got one parking stall per unit, and you have no parking structures. Now, this was already being done in others like Portland, Oregon, and stuff like that. They were trying to constrict the use of cars. But in this case, it's different because you're actually designing that in as a premise that you're going to force people to get rid of their cars or not use their cars because they literally have no place to put the bunkers. It was an incredibly interesting idea and a fascinating example of how you can actually use design to manipulate behavior because you just don't allow people to do something. There's just physically no space for it. And so they then try to figure out how they're going to work this. The state's fascinated with the idea. They immediately approve it. They then approach the folks on the other side of Ward Avenue, Kamehameha Schools, and say, we want to do this. But we want to make it more acceptable to the local population because now you've got to wean people off the idea of a home and replace it with the idea of a condo. And how are you going to get the local population to switch their mindset from the idea of my house to my condo and not seeing that like a penalty? How can these places become final residences for families? And Kamehameha Schools jumps on it for two reasons. One is they're divesting themselves at that point of the mainland, which would turn out to be a disaster. Bishop Estates enfolding back into Kamehameha Schools for a bunch of semi-shady reasons. But the end result is Kamehameha Schools needs a new direction. They have a huge amount of the property down here. They don't know what to do with it. And they look at this and they come up with a fascinating joint discussion with GGP. Is what you do is you actually look at Hong Kong and you look more specifically at Japanese urban neighborhoods. Tokyo, Osaka, wherever, like Namba in Osaka. And what you find is that people can live in high rises, people can live in very congested situations and still have a sense of neighborhood. You see this all the way through Europe, for example, in Paris, for example, or Lyon. And you can do that. You don't need houses. Houses were an affectation of the last part of the 20th century in the United States, largely driven by the construction industry and government. If you can change people's mindset by giving them an alternative, you might be able to get, especially here in Hawaii, get people away from the idea of the home and back to the idea of a residence. And of course, the difference between home and residence is a residence doesn't necessarily have to be freestanding. And so what Kamehameha Schools GGP come up with is the idea of what they call in quotes the Hawaiian village. And so they talk about the Ward Avenue village. They talk about Kakaako. They start to talk about it and present it in the terms of a residential neighborhood. The only difference is now your neighborhood's vertical, just like you see in Mongkok in Hong Kong or again in Namba and Osaka. And if you're going to make that work, then what you're going to have to provide is all your amenities only have to be within convenient walking distance. So you suddenly change your idea of retail from sort of Ala Moana type stores that are largely catering towards tourists. And you actually change it to what you would see on the streets in, say, Osaka or in Hong Kong, which is restaurants. Convenience is the folks need that they want to get right outside their house. So sort of, regular shopping and stuff like that. And it has to be so close that they have no need for a car, that anything you buy, you can lug to your apartment. This becomes pushed by Kamehameha Schools, and this becomes a centerpiece and still is a centerpiece of their urban plan. It so happens because of the urban discussions, especially the discussions of sustainability that start going on this period of time. The Kamehameha Schools especially jumps on this. and points out that if you're really looking at a sustainable population of a million plus people on the island of Oahu, you cannot do it by building subdivisions out in Kapolei and Ewa such, because that's all farmland, that's all agricultural land, and every house you put up destroys that much farmland. So if you want to have sustainability and self-sufficiency, you're not going to do it with subdivisions. Subdivisions are exactly the opposite of that. If you want to do that, you're going to do it with high rises in areas that have already been urbanized. And Kakaako by the 20th century was gone. You know, there was no longer any of those images we saw last time. There's no longer any farms here. There's no longer any dairies here. There's no longer any fish ponds here. So this area has already been messed up in terms of its agricultural or food productivity. And so what you do is you're now changing it from one type of urban use, low-rise residential industrial, to high-rise residential commercial. And they argue that this is the model that should be used for the island of Oahu. Now, the city and county actually, ironically, since they're not big fans of all this, actually jump on board because they're already looking at the rail project, and the idea that you could run rail through here would then, because there's going to be a lot of jobs down here, you know, among other things, just in the stores and such. You can then put people on the rail. They're going to come down here. They have to use the rail because they can't find a place to park their car. For the folks in here, they're going to use rail if they want to go to some other part of the island. The original proposal actually includes a cute little sort of shuttle tram system through here, tied to Ala Moana Center and downtown, so that people here can basically work downtown or work at Ala Moana, and they don't need a car. So the whole push of this is actually not only to reduce the number of cars, but actually to get rid of cars. The dream version of this would be that people who live in these high rises here don't have cars. They might have an e-bike or something like that, but they don't need an automobile. And there's no functional reason they need an automobile. Now you have to remember this is pre-COVID, so this is pre like e-delivery services and such like that. So by 2006, 2007, this gets approved. HCDA approves this plan, and this becomes what Kakaako is going to turn into. Now, there's all sorts of fascinating ways that this is spun, and we're going to take very quickly 2 looks at this, because you remember you're trying to sell this to a population that still has a mindset of the single-family home. They want to place in a Harita development in Ewa, or they want to buy a house in Hawaii Kai or something like that. They don't want a high rise. To them, a condo is the first place that you buy before you can afford a house. Well, the attitude of Kamehameha School's GGP is that they have to change that. So you have to make these actually permanent investments. Now, the initial investment, the initial towers they put up, they initially sell, they figure they're going to sell maybe 20-30% of them to folks here in Hawaii. The vast majority are going to be sold on the mainland. This is coming up at the same time as Trump Tower, which wasn't even advertised here in Hawaii. So in Waikiki, what you see is your conversions of hotels into residential units is sold almost entirely in Asia and the US mainland, specifically LA and Denver. Here, they're not putting much marketing effort into here because they again think that their main sales are going to be the mainland and Asia with part-time residents. Much to their shock, when they put these up, immediately they just almost immediately sell out, and almost everyone, 80% of the folks buying into them are local residents. It's folks that, for example, live in Hawaii Kai that don't want to deal with Kalanianaole everyday traffic when they work downtown for the state. So that in a moment of sort of light bulb going off, they realize that there actually is a huge demand here in Honolulu for people who have actually had it with gridlock traffic, have had it with commuting in for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, like what I used to from Maiea into downtown. And they can't afford it. They can't afford the parking fees. They can't afford the stress. They can't afford any of it. And if you can actually provide a nice place to live in an urban area where you can do things by walking, you can actually walk to work, and there's stuff to do. You have to park and stuff. Then we'll jump on it. And so that becomes Kakaako. Kakaako becomes the success story of actually telling people they can't use their cars, but you only do that in the context of providing them with viable alternatives. It's not just you can't use your car or else you're a bad person. You have to provide positives, the carrot and the stick, if you would. And so this becomes Kakaako. Now, from an interior designer standpoint, the interesting thing about it is this is, of course, the future for much of urban Honolulu. Subdivisions are going up in Kapolei Ewa. Those are pretty much going to be soon priced out of existence. The cost of infrastructure, the cost of utilities and stuff is going to continue to skyrocket. The cost of water is going to go up. We've already seen that problem. Environmental impact of high rise is significantly less than the subdivision, just because things are much more efficient. The state, ironically, who was the original purveyor of all this, then basically is also the one that decided under push again from developers, just like originally for Kakaako, push from developers, put in all the subdivisions and quote the second city, Kapolei. City and county realized that they can't afford to constantly be expanding the road network and everything else like that. And so city and counties now become a big player in all this. One of the interesting aspects about this is you're actually looking at near Hong Kong levels of density in terms of high rises. And yet the way these are all presented is they're very ambivalent about that. So here's the last of the award now / Hughes presentations for what their final area of their section of Kakaako is going to look like. What's really interesting, of course, is all this area here that's in brown isn't low. It's just they're not bothering to put that in because they don't want it to make it a little more congested. So if you look at this, you sort of assume that, for example, this structure here is pretty much, oh, they're going to have a nice view and they're not really congested. There's actually 3 more high rises going in over here, but they don't belong to Hughes. So Hughes is under no obligation to image them. And so what you get is this whole area is actually a massive increase in population. Already up 25,000. By 2027, there's going to be 35, 40,000 people living in this particular area. And yet the interesting thing is the amount of car traffic has really not gone up tremendously. So ironically, despite the fact they didn't really present these accurately, the original premise that GGP had was if you don't give people places to put cars, then they're going to, but you give them things to do, they will find an alternative to the car. And so ironically, this predates a lot of the changes we now see going on, the increased use of mopeds, e-bikes, and such like that. Post-date all this, the massive increase in delivery services, GoHub and all these other places, post-date this coming up. And so what's happened is this has now become the model, for example, for many urban areas on the mainland of reconverting suburbs, excuse me, into these types of urbanized centers. We actually restrict the use of cars as a way to get people to shift back to a more, I'm not sure rational is the right way, but a more viable environmental alternative to the, suburban ranch style house with a front and backyard, which only existed in a period of time when you thought resources were basically inexhaustible. Now, one of the sort of last note of this, let's take a look here. This is one of the sort of fascinating aspects of this type of sales pitch. You've got to promote the idea that living in a high rise or a condo is a legitimate alternative to a house, not a temporary, but a permanent alternative. What you then have to do is sort of downplay the actual environment people are putting themselves into. So this is one of the CAM schools images for Keho Place. What's really interesting about this artistic rendering, which was one of the ones they used when they were pre-selling. So I should point out that all these high rises pre-sale. So before you even put a hole in the ground for this high rise, you're already selling the units. And one of the things that's made Kakaako so successful, if you go down there, it's worth going down there because in 6 months it will have changed. There's 3 main high rises being finished as we speak. There's 4 more that are under construction by the start of 2024. And so literally that place is changing. If you stand still, it changes look. So if this were an accurate rendering of this structure, there'd be 7 other high rises around here. But you don't want to image that. You want people to think they've got the only one. And so you intentionally misrepresent what the urban skyline looks like in Kakaako so that people don't get too much of a sense of congestion until they've already purchased it, at which point it's too late to get out of it. And so what you find is what's really interesting about Kakaako is the developments in Kakaako have been basically pre-selling between 50 and 80%. The early ones sold out to 110%. So the earliest developments, both from Ward / Howard Hughes and also from Kamehameha Schools, were completely sold out before they even started construction. The ones that are going up right now, I believe, are 80 or 90% sold. which means in a weird way that developers not risking any money when they put this building up because they've already sold it. They've already amortized all their payments and everything off of that before they even started building it. This, of course, creates some problems in terms of quality control. Because in some ways, if you're the builder, you're not as motivated to worry about quality if you've already sold it. It's the owner's problem. This is starting to become an issue in Kakaako. But that's solvable. But what's really interesting is the way that you image this whole sense of urbanization. You don't image it as Hong Kong. You don't image it as urban Osaka or Tokyo. You image it as sort of freestanding high rises with a view of the ocean and the mountains and open sky. And of course, this is in contrast to people's very obvious view of Kapolei, of Hawaii Kai or wherever, where you're smack dab in fairly small homes next to a bunch of other small homes. And so what you're doing is you're trying to present this as a legitimate family-based alternative. Now, the problem you get as an interior designer is not so much the square meters interiors, but what square meter interior, what type of furniture, how do you present this to make it a comfortable local home when it's in a high rise? Because the comfortable local home was, of course, a single family home in some part of Honolulu. Here we're not too far away. We're in I think here's McKinney High School over here. So here's the neighborhood right around Kakaako. This image is from 3 years ago, so there's already 4 more high rises here that you don't see. This whole area is going to be high rises. Kamehameha Schools is in the process of developing a lot of their properties along King Street, including University, into high-rise versions of this. Kakaako has now become the urban model. Certainly as for Kalihi, where a couple on the stream is going to be entirely basically a remake of Kakaako. This is the new urban pattern. And I think if you're an interior designer, one of the things you have to start visualizing is, here you've got the single family homes and whatever people did, whatever furniture they put into it, however they modeled it to make it a comfortable local style house or local style residence. How do you do that with modern high rises? And what do you do that makes it comfortable versus, say, inspiration leather furniture or something like that? How do you actually make these into comfortable, permanent local residences where families, spend 20, 30, 40 years in them in high rises? Not hard to do. It's done a lot in Asia, but it's something very different for the American mindset. I think this is the big challenge for interior designers, and interior designers that manage to make this work, I think are going to find themselves with really large consultancy practices, because we've done a fair amount of work with Hughes, though with their new management, we're not talking to them anymore. But one of the interesting things that Hughes had pointed out to us is they're having a terribly difficult time getting local interior designers to help them in terms of modeling units and building interiors that would be attractive to local customers, which are the majority of their buyers. What they were getting is they were largely subcontracting out to mainland firms, largely Seattle, and ended up with interiors that were appropriate to, say, the Pacific Northwest or California, but weren't necessarily particularly attractive to a local population, which has a very different view of family, place, and objects. And they were having a very difficult time getting local interior designers to see them seriously in terms of condos is actually a business proposition for interior design. So I might leave with that sort of as a final thought on all this, the importance of Kakaako. Kakaako is the future of interior design here at Hawaii. And if you're in that business or want to be in that business, it behooves you to try to figure out how to make these into local places